Do not stain this room with your silence, girl. If you have nothing valuable to offer, at least have the manners to disappear." The words struck harder than the glass of red wine that followed. The room at Ashcombe had fallen into a strange, uncomfortable stillness before the laughter came. Lady Corisande Vale lifted the empty crystal glass from the edge of the supper table and tilted it with deliberate calm. The wine poured over the pale blue gown of the young woman standing near the fireplace, spreading like a dark wound across the silk. Ottilie Ashcombe did not move. The guests surrounding her did. A few ladies covered their mouths with gloved hands, not from shock but to hide their smiles. Two young gentlemen near the chandelier exchanged amused looks. Someone behind her whispered that perhaps the quiet daughter of Ashcombe had finally learned where she belonged. The servants remained frozen along the walls. Everyone saw, everyone heard, and yet no one stepped forward. Lady Corisande smiled, as though she had merely corrected a minor mistake in etiquette. The widow of the late Earl Ashcombe had spent 3 years transforming the estate into a place where every person knew their rank, and tonight she wanted all of London society to know that Ottilie no longer possessed one. The young woman lowered her eyes, not because she was defeated, but because she understood something important. In that room, dignity was not protected by those who claimed to value it. It was protected only by those willing to fight for it. What none of them knew was that the humiliation they had witnessed that evening was only the beginning of a secret hidden inside Ashcombe's walls, a secret that would one day shake the entire family and reveal a truth no one in that room was prepared to face. Before we return to the beginning of Ottilie Ashcombe's story, tell us where you are listening from today. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another forgotten voice finding justice, and support the channel as we continue sharing stories of courage, dignity, and truth. Now, let us return to the cold winter that changed everything. 3 years earlier, Ashcombe had still been known as one of the proudest estates in the countryside of England. The great house stood beyond a long avenue of bare trees, its stone walls dark beneath the winter sky. The servants polished silver trays beside warm kitchen fires, horses waited beneath covered stalls, and the drawing rooms remained filled with the quiet confidence of a family that believed its name would last forever. But within those walls, confidence and kindness were not the same thing. Ottilie Ashcombe had always known the difference. She was 23 years old when her father, the late Earl Ashcombe, first brought Lady Corisande into the household as his second wife. Ottilie remembered the woman arriving with perfect posture, expensive fabrics, and a voice that sounded gentle enough to deceive anyone who did not listen carefully. At first, Corisande had called her dear child. She had touched her shoulder in front of guests. She had praised her patience and modesty. But behind closed doors, the affection disappeared. Ottilie was not the daughter Corisande wanted. She was not a son who could inherit the title. She was not a wealthy young woman with powerful connections who could strengthen the family name. She was simply the late Earl's daughter, a reminder that the estate belonged to another bloodline before Corisande's influence took hold. The Earl had loved his daughter in his own quiet way. He was not a man who spoke often of feelings. He preferred letters, careful accounts, and practical gifts rather than grand declarations. Yet Ottilie had always known that when her mother died, her father had become the one person in Ashcombe who never asked her to become someone else. He taught her to read estate records. He allowed her to sit in the library while he worked. He told her that a person who understood numbers and people would never truly be powerless. At the time, Ottilie believed those lessons were simply a father's kindness. She did not know they would become the foundation of her survival. After the Earl's death, everything changed. The funeral had taken place beneath a sky filled with freezing rain. The family chapel had been crowded with noble guests wearing black coats and solemn expressions. Everyone had spoken about the loss of a respected man. Almost no one spoke about what would happen to his daughter. The answer came quickly. Within weeks, Lady Corisande began removing Ottilie from the life she had always known. Her invitations stopped arriving. Her household allowance was reduced. Her gowns were no longer ordered from London. Her rooms, once overlooking the gardens, were quietly moved to a smaller chamber on the colder side of the house. When Ottilie asked why, Corisande had smiled. A young woman without a husband must learn economy, she had said. It was not cruelty, she claimed. It was preparation. But Ottilie understood the difference between preparation and punishment. The real reason was hidden inside the Earl's unfinished affairs. There were questions about the estate accounts, questions about the management of certain lands, questions about money that seemed to disappear after Corisande became the head of the household. Ottilie had noticed small details because her father had trained her to notice them. A payment recorded twice, a tenant's name removed from a ledger, a solicitor's letter that arrived, but was never shown to her. Nothing was enough to accuse anyone, but together, the pieces formed a shape she could not ignore. The library had become forbidden territory. The old study where her father kept his papers remained locked most evenings. Corisande carried the key herself, attached to a small chain hidden beneath her gown. Ottilie had once asked if she could review her father's final accounts. The reaction was immediate. Lady Corisande had laughed softly. "How touching," she said. A young lady imagining herself a steward. The remark had been made before several relatives during afternoon tea. No one laughed loudly. They did not need to. The silence was enough. Ottilie learned then that humiliation among the wealthy was rarely loud. Sometimes it arrived through a raised eyebrow, a forgotten invitation, a servant instructed not to answer a door. A person could be erased without anyone ever admitting they had done it. By the winter of the wine incident, Ottilie had spent months trying to survive without creating a scandal. She knew how quickly society judged women who challenged their families. A man could be stubborn, a woman could be called difficult, a man could demand answers. A woman demanding the truth was often accused of bitterness. That was why she remained quiet, not because she had nothing to say, because she was choosing the moment when her words would matter. The night Lady Corisande poured wine over her gown had begun, as a celebration. A gathering of wealthy families had arrived at Ashcombe to discuss marriages, inheritances and alliances. The ballroom shone beneath candlelight. Musicians played near the staircase. The guests wore silk, velvet, and jewels that represented fortunes built over generations. The table displayed the wealth of Ashcombe openly. There were silver dishes filled with roasted pheasant, delicate pastries arranged beside porcelain plates, crystal decanters, and imported fruits placed carefully among the candles. Ottilie had worn the blue gown because it had belonged to her mother. It was not the most expensive dress in the room, but it was the one thing she still possessed that connected her to the woman who had loved her before Ashcombe became a battlefield. Lady Corisande knew that. That was why she chose it. The insult had begun when one of the guests asked whether Ottilie would be attending the London season. Before Ottilie could answer, Corisande had laughed. The poor girl still imagines she has a future there. The words had been followed by polite smiles. Ottilie had simply replied that every person deserved the chance to build a future. That sentence had angered Corisande more than any accusation, because it was not a plea, it was a declaration. The wine came moments later. Afterward, while the guests continued their conversations, Ottilie quietly left the ballroom. The cold air outside struck her immediately. The servant's entrance was not far away. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to stand outside a home that had once belonged to her. The frost covered the stone steps. The windows glowed warmly behind her. Inside was the world she had lost. Outside was the world she had not yet built. She did not cry. Not because she did not hurt, because she had already spent too many years allowing other people to decide what her pain meant. As she stood beneath the bare trees, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Mrs. Eliza Whitcombe, the elderly housekeeper who had served Ashcombe since before Ottilie was born. The older woman held a shawl around her shoulders. "You should not be standing here without a coat," she whispered. Ottilie gave a faint smile. "I believe that was the intention." Mrs. Whitcombe looked toward the ballroom windows. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she reached into her apron pocket and removed a small folded piece of paper. Ottilie recognized the handwriting immediately. Her father's. The sight of it made her heart stop. "Where did you find this?" The housekeeper glanced toward the darkened corridor leading back inside. "Not found," she answered. "Hidden." Ottilie unfolded the paper carefully. Most of the writing had faded, but one line remained clear. The truth of Ashcombe must never depend on the person holding the key. She read it twice, then a third time. Mrs. Whitcombe lowered her voice. Your father knew there were matters in the house that were not as they appeared. Before Ottilie could ask more, a sound came from the corridor. A door closing. Someone had been listening. The housekeeper quickly hid the paper again. Neither woman spoke until the footsteps disappeared. That was the first moment in Ottilie's life when she understood that Ashcombe was not merely a place where she had been wronged. It was a place where someone had worked very carefully to hide the truth. The following morning, Lady Corisande summoned her to the study, the locked room, the room her father once used. Ottilie entered and found her stepmother sitting behind the large wooden desk. On the table lay a document. Beside it was a pen, and beside the pen was a small silver key. Corisande looked at her with a calm expression. You have always been a quiet girl, Ottilie. That has been your greatest weakness. She pushed the paper forward. But today, you will finally make yourself useful. Ottilie looked down. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was a document that would change everything. And as she reached toward it, she noticed the name written at the bottom was not her own. It belonged to someone who was never supposed to have control of Ashcombe at all. Ottilie did not immediately touch the document. She had learned that in Ashcombe, papers were often more dangerous than words. Words could be denied. A document could change the course of a family for generations. She looked again at the signature line. The name written there was not Lady Corisande Vale. It was not even the name of a relative. It was the name of Mr. Percival Hargrove, a solicitor who had never before been mentioned in any family gathering, yet whose handwriting appeared on several account letters that Ottilie remembered seeing among her father's papers. Her eyes moved across the page slowly. It was an authorization transferring certain responsibilities connected to the Ashcombe estate. Not ownership, not legally, but control. The difference was small enough for someone who wanted power and large enough to destroy a family. Lady Corisande watched her carefully. You see the difficulty now, do you not? Ottilie raised her eyes. The difficulty is that you require my signature for something that my father never intended. A faint smile appeared on Corisande's face. There it was, the first sign of resistance. For months, Ottilie had been the quiet daughter who lowered her gaze, accepted reduced allowances, and walked through the house as though apologizing for taking up space. Corisande had mistaken silence for weakness. That mistake would become expensive. You have no position here, Corisande said. No husband, no son, no authority. The world outside these walls will not listen to a young woman with a wounded pride. Ottilie looked around the study. The shelves still held her father's books. The old writing desk still carried the marks where he had placed his pen every morning. The room was filled with memories of a man who had taught her that careful observation was more powerful than loud accusation. For the first time in her life, Ottilie understood something clearly. Her father had not taught her how to win arguments. He had taught her how to discover the truth. I will not sign anything today, she said. The room became silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of guests hiding their amusement. A different kind. The silence of someone who had finally refused to surrender. Corisande's expression hardened. You should consider your situation very carefully. I have considered it, Ottilie replied. And I believe I would rather lose a house than give away the right to know why I lost it. For a moment, Corisande looked almost surprised. Then the surprise disappeared. Very well. She reached for the small silver bell beside the desk and rang it. When the footman appeared, she did not look at Ottilie. Escort Miss Ashcombe back to her room. The instructions sounded polite. That made it worse. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene. Only the quiet removal of a person who had once belonged. As Ottilie walked through the hallway, she noticed the servants watching from the edges of the house. Some lowered their eyes, some looked away. But Mrs. Whitcombe stood near the staircase, and the old housekeeper's expression told Ottilie something important. She was not alone. Later that evening, while the rain tapped against the windows, Ottilie returned to her smaller chamber and placed the folded note from her father beneath the candlelight. She had spent years believing that surviving Ashcombe meant enduring quietly until someone kinder rescued her. That belief had ended. A rescue was something that happened to a person. A choice was something a person made. She opened the small wooden box where she kept the few belongings her father had left her. Inside were old letters, a pearl brooch from her mother, and a narrow account notebook. She had not looked at it in months. The notebook contained the figures her father once allowed her to copy while he worked in the library. At the time, she had thought the numbers were merely lessons. Now she wondered whether he had been preparing her for a day he knew might come. As she turned the pages, she found several entries that did not match the estate records she had been shown after his death. The differences were small. A payment changed by a few pounds. A tenant's account closed earlier than expected. A transfer recorded without explanation. Nothing that could defeat a powerful family alone. But enough to prove that someone had altered the story of Ashcombe. The next morning, Ottilie made a decision that frightened her more than leaving the ballroom after the wine incident. She would stop asking permission to exist. She would find the truth herself. Before breakfast, she walked to the servants' corridor and found Mrs. Whitcombe arranging linen. The old housekeeper immediately understood from her face that something had changed. "You saw something in the study, did you not?" Ottilie nodded. Mrs. Whitcombe looked toward the empty corridor. Then she lowered her voice. "There is someone else who may help you." "Who?" "A man who worked for your father before Lady Corisande dismissed him, Mr. Thomas Bell. He kept the estate accounts for many years." Ottilie remembered the name. Her father had trusted him. "Where is he now?" "Living in the village. He runs a small shop near the market road." "Why did he leave?" Mrs. Whitcombe hesitated. "Because he refused to change figures that did not belong together." The answer settled heavily between them. Ottilie felt a coldness that had nothing to do with winter, not because she was afraid, because she finally understood the size of what she was facing. Lady Corisande had not simply taken control of a household. She had built a system where people who questioned her were removed quietly. Letters disappeared. Servants left. Accounts changed. And everyone was expected to accept the new version of reality. That afternoon, Ottilie prepared to leave Ashcombe for the village under the excuse of visiting a seamstress. It was the first small act of independence she had taken since her father's death. But as she reached the entrance hall, she saw Lady Corisande standing there. The widow held a letter in her hand, a letter that Ottilie recognized. Her father's solicitor's seal was visible on the wax. Corisande smiled. "It seems, dear Ottilie, that you are not the only person searching through old matters." Ottilie stopped, because she knew then that her stepmother had discovered something. And whatever was hidden inside Ashcombe's past, both women were now moving toward it. Only one of them knew the whole truth. Ottilie nhìn chăm chăm vào phong thư trong tay Lady Corisande. Nàng không cần nhìn kỹ cũng biết con dấu ấy. Đó là dấu của văn phòng luật sư từng phụ trách những công việc riêng của cha nàng. Trong nhiều tháng qua, nàng đã cố gắng tìm kiếm bất kỳ dấu vết nào liên quan đến những ngày cuối cùng của cha mình. Nhưng tất cả những gì nàng nhận được chỉ là sự im lặng, những câu trả lời mơ hồ và những cánh cửa đóng lại ngay trước mặt. Giờ đây, một trong những cánh cửa ấy đang nằm trong tay người, muốn nàng biến mất khỏi Ashcombe. Lady Corisande xoay nhẹ phong thư. "Thật đáng tiếc phải không? Một người con gái thông minh như cô lại mất quá nhiều thời gian để hiểu rằng có những chuyện trong gia đình này không thuộc về cô." Ottilie giữ ánh mắt bình tĩnh. "Nếu nó không thuộc về tôi, tại sao bà lại lo lắng khi tôi tìm hiểu?" Câu hỏi khiến nụ cười trên môi Corisande chậm lại. Chỉ một thoáng, nhưng Ottilie nhìn thấy nàng đã từng bỏ qua những khoảnh khắc như thế. Những cái cau mày rất nhỏ, những lần Corisande dừng lại trước khi trả lời, những ánh mắt trao đổi giữa bà ta và những người thân cận, nhưng không còn nữa. Lần đầu tiên trong đời, Ottilie bắt đầu quan sát người khác không phải để tránh làm họ khó chịu, mà để hiểu họ. Lady Corisande bước đến gần hơn. Cô đang nhầm lẫn giữa tò mò và quyền lực. Một người phụ nữ trẻ không có tài sản riêng, không có chồng, không có người bảo vệ, sẽ không thắng được một cuộc chiến với cả xã hội. Chỉ bằng vài nghi ngờ, Ottilie nhìn xuống đôi găng tay của mình. Ngày trước, những lời đó có thể khiến nàng im lặng. Nhưng giờ đây, nàng nghe thấy một điều khác bên dưới sự khinh miệt ấy, sợ hãi. Không phải nỗi sợ mất đi tình cảm của một người con gái, mà là nỗi sợ mất đi quyền kiểm soát. "Tôi không tìm kiếm quyền lực," Ottilie nói. Nàng ngẩng đầu. "Tôi chỉ muốn biết cha tôi đã để lại điều gì cho tôi." Lady Corisande cười nhạt. "Cha cô đã để lại cho cô một cái tên, chỉ thế thôi." Rồi bà ta quay đi. Nhưng trước khi rời khỏi sảnh, Corisande dừng lại. Ottilie, có lẽ cô nên nhớ một điều. Nàng chờ đợi. Một người phụ nữ bị xã hội quay lưng thường không mất mọi thứ trong một ngày. Cô ấy mất từng chút một. Một lời đồn, một cánh cửa đóng lại, một người bạn biến mất, một cơ hội bị lấy đi. Rồi đến một lúc, cô ấy nhận ra chẳng còn ai đứng bên cạnh. Lady Corisande bước đi. Ottilie đứng một mình trong đại sảnh lạnh lẽo. Nhưng lần này, sự cô độc không khiến nàng sợ hãi, bởi vì lần đầu tiên, nàng biết mình đang chiến đấu vì điều gì. Chiều hôm đó, Ottilie rời Ashcombe bằng chiếc xe ngựa nhỏ được chuẩn bị kín đáo. Nàng không đi cùng người hầu riêng, không mang theo hành lý lớn, không để ai trong nhà có lý do đặt câu hỏi. Con đường dẫn về ngôi làng gần đó phủ đầy bùn sau những trận mưa lạnh. Những cánh đồng trơ trụi kéo dài dưới bầu trời xám. Bên trong xe ngựa, Ottilie giữ chặt cuốn sổ nhỏ của cha trong tay. Nó không còn là vật kỷ niệm nữa. Nó đã trở thành lời nhắc nhở rằng nàng vẫn còn một phần của Ashcombe mà không ai lấy được. Khi đến khu chợ láng, nàng nhìn thấy một thế giới hoàn toàn khác. Không có phòng khiêu vũ, không có những chiếc váy nhung đắt tiền, không có những người cười sau lưng người khác bằng giọng nói nhẹ nhàng. Chỉ có những người bán hàng gọi nhau giữa làn khói từ những bếp nhỏ, những người lao động kéo xe qua con đường ướt và những gia đình tính toán từng đồng bảng để sống qua mùa đông. Ottilie bước vào cửa hàng nhỏ cuối khu chợ. Tấm biển gỗ cũ phía trên cửa chỉ ghi tên Bell. Bên trong, mùi giấy, trà và gỗ cũ hòa vào nhau. Một người đàn ông khoảng 60 tuổi đang sắp xếp sổ sách phía sau quầy. Ông nhìn lên và ngay lập tức nhận ra nàng, Miss Ashcombe. Giọng ông không lớn, nhưng sự kinh ngạc trong đó rất rõ. Ông cúi đầu. Tôi không nghĩ sẽ còn gặp cô ở đây. Ottilie tháo găng tay. Tôi cũng không nghĩ mình sẽ phải tìm ông. Ông Bell nhìn quanh cửa hàng rồi kéo ghế. Ngồi xuống đi. Có những chuyện về Ashcombe không nên được nói khi người ta đang đứng. Câu nói ấy khiến Ottilie hiểu rằng người đàn ông này đã chờ đợi ngày có ai đó hỏi ông, nhưng ông cũng đã chờ đợi trong im lặng. Ông mở một ngăn kéo nhỏ phía dưới quầy. Bên trong là một tập giấy được bọc bằng vải. Tôi giữ những thứ này vì cha cô đã yêu cầu tôi làm vậy. Ottilie nín thở. Cha tôi biết chuyện sao? Ông Bell nhìn xuống những tờ giấy. Cha cô biết có người đang cố thay đổi cách vận hành của điển trang. Nhưng ông không nghĩ mình sẽ mất nhiều thời gian như vậy để chứng minh. Ông đặt lên bàn một bản sao sổ sách. Có những khoản tiền rời khỏi Ashcombe trước khi ông qua đời. Những khoản tiền này được ghi dưới danh nghĩa sửa chữa, mua vật tư và chi phí quản lý. Nhưng tiền không đi đến nơi được ghi trên giấy. Ottilie lật từng trang. Một số tên xuất hiện nhiều lần, một số khoản chi biến mất. Và ở cuối một trang, nàng nhìn thấy chữ ký của Mr. Percival Hargrove, người đàn ông trong giấy tờ sáng này. Ông Bell gật đầu. Cha cô từng nghi ngờ ông ta, nhưng ông cần bằng chứng. Tại sao ông không nói với tôi? Câu hỏi bật ra nhanh hơn nàng dự định. Ông Bell im lặng một lúc. Bởi vì sau khi cha cô qua đời, tôi đã thử. Tôi gửi thư, tôi tìm cách gặp cô. Nhưng mọi lá thư tôi gửi đến Ashcombe đều không bao giờ được trả lời. Ottilie cảm thấy bàn tay mình lạnh đi, không phải vì thời tiết, mà vì nàng nhớ lại những lần nàng chờ thư của những người họ hàng, những người quen cũ, những người từng nói họ quan tâm đến nàng. Có lẽ chưa từng có lá thư nào đến được tay nàng. Sự thật ấy đau hơn cả lời xúc phạm trong phòng khiêu vũ, bởi vì nó có nghĩa là nàng đã không bị bỏ quên, nàng đã bị cô lập, cẩn thận, có chủ ý. Ông Bell lấy ra một mảnh giấy khác. Còn một chuyện nữa. Ottilie nhìn lên. Ông do dự. Cha cô để lại một chỉ dẫn. Nếu một ngày cô tìm đến tôi, nghĩa là cô đã bị ép phải tự bảo vệ mình. Ông đẩy mảnh giấy về phía nàng. Trên đó là vài dòng chữ quen thuộc. Nếu Ottilie phải tìm đến sự thật, hãy trao cho con bé những gì ta đã giấu đi. Nó có thể không có quyền lực, nhưng nó có trí nhớ, lòng can đảm và sự ngay thẳng. Nước mắt nóng lên trong mắt Ottilie. Nhưng nàng không khóc, không phải lúc này. Không phải khi lần đầu tiên sau nhiều tháng, nàng cảm thấy cha mình chưa từng thật sự bỏ rơi nàng. Ông Bell nhìn nàng. Cô biết điều gì sẽ xảy ra nếu tiếp tục chứ? Ottilie gấp tờ giấy lại. Có, và ông. Tôi biết. Cả hai im lặng. Ngoài cửa hàng, tiếng bánh xe ngựa lăn trên con đường ướt. Rồi Ottilie nhận ra một điều. Corisande không chỉ đang cố đuổi nàng khỏi Ashcombe. Bà ta đang cố xóa bỏ một sự thật đã tồn tại trước khi bà ta bước chân vào căn nhà đó. Nhưng trong lúc Ottilie nhìn xuống những giấy tờ trên bàn, nàng không biết rằng tại Ashcombe, Lady Corisande cũng đã bắt đầu một bước đi mới. Một bước đi nhằm khiến cả xã hội tin rằng Ottilie Ashcombe không còn đủ tỉnh táo để được lắng nghe. Và lần này, bà ta không định chỉ lấy đi ngôi nhà của nàng. Bà ta định lấy đi danh tiếng của nàng trước khi nàng có cơ hội nói ra sự thật. Ottilie trở về Ashcombe khi trời đã tối. Chiếc xe ngựa dừng lại trước cổng lớn trong tiếng bánh xe nghiến trên nền đá ướt. Những ngọn đèn gas ngoài sân hắt ánh sáng vàng nhạt lên bức tường đá lạnh lẽo. Dinh thự vẫn đứng đó, cao lớn và im lặng, như thể chưa từng có chuyện gì xảy ra bên trong những bức tường ấy. Nhưng Ottilie đã thay đổi. Nàng không còn nhìn Ashcombe như ngôi nhà từng nuôi dưỡng mình. Nàng nhìn nó như một nơi đang che giấu một bí mật. Khi bước vào sảnh, nàng lập tức nhận ra có điều khác thường. Hai người hầu đang nói nhỏ gần cầu thang. Khi thấy nàng xuất hiện, họ lập tức im bặt. Trước đây, Ottilie có thể đã nghĩ họ đang nói về mình. Nhưng giờ đây, nàng biết có một khả năng khác. Có người đã muốn họ nói về nàng. Mrs. Whitcombe xuất hiện từ hành lang phía sau, gương mặt bà căng thẳng. Miss Ashcombe, bà nói nhỏ. Có chuyện xảy ra trong lúc cô đi. Ottilie tháo găng tay. Lady Corisande, bà quản gia gật đầu. Bà ấy đã mời vài vị khách đến dùng trà chiều. Ai? Mrs. Whitcombe nhìn về phía phòng khách, một vài người quen của gia đình. Hai phu nhân từng thân thiết với cha cô. Một người họ hàng bên phía Vale, bà dừng lại, và một thầy thuốc. Ottilie khựng lại. Một thầy thuốc? Mrs. Whitcombe không trả lời ngay. Đó là lúc Ottilie hiểu. Corisande đã không chỉ muốn phá hủy danh tiếng của nàng. Bà ta đang xây dựng một câu chuyện. Một câu chuyện trong đó Ottilie không phải là người tìm kiếm sự thật, mà là một người phụ nữ trẻ mất cân bằng, bị ám ảnh bởi những nghi ngờ không có căn cứ. Nàng bước đến gần cửa phòng khách. Qua khe cửa chưa đóng hoàn toàn, nàng nghe thấy giọng Lady Corisande. Ta chỉ muốn bảo vệ gia đình. Giọng một người đàn ông lớn tuổi vang lên. Tôi hiểu, thưa phu nhân, nhưng cô Ashcombe chưa từng có hành vi nguy hiểm nào. Corisande thở dài. Đó chính là điều khiến mọi người khó nhận ra. Những người như vậy thường không biểu hiện rõ ràng. Ottilie đứng yên. Không phải vì sợ hãi, mà vì nàng đang nghe thấy chính xác thứ mà mình đã đoán. Một lời vu cáo được tạo ra bằng những câu nói nhẹ nhàng, không phải một lời buộc tội, không phải một cuộc tấn công trực diện, mà là những hạt giống nghi ngờ được gieo vào đầu người khác. Nàng lùi lại trước khi bị phát hiện. Mrs. Whitcombe đi theo nàng về phía hành lang. Bà ta sẽ nói rằng cô tưởng tượng ra mọi chuyện. Bà nói. Ottilie nhìn lên. Bởi vì nếu xã hội tin rằng tôi không đáng tin, thì không ai cần nghe bằng chứng của tôi nữa. Bà quản gia im lặng. Đó chính là điều đáng sợ. Ottilie nhìn về phía cánh cửa phòng làm việc của cha mình, nhưng bà ấy đã phạm một sai lầm. Sai lầm gì? Bà ấy nghĩ rằng chỉ có người giàu mới có tiếng nói. Một nụ cười rất nhẹ xuất hiện trên gương mặt Ottilie. Nhưng sự thật không sống trong những căn phòng lớn nhất, nó sống ở nơi người ta còn nhớ. Ngày hôm sau, Ottilie không đến London như Lady Corisande có thể đã dự đoán. Nàng cũng không chạy đến những người quý tộc để cầu xin họ tin mình. Nàng làm điều ngược lại. Nàng bắt đầu xây dựng một cuộc sống mà không ai có thể lấy khỏi nàng. Theo lời giới thiệu của ông Bell, nàng tìm đến một người phụ nữ góa chồng trong làng, người điều hành một cửa hàng nhỏ chuyên bán vải và đồ dùng may vá. Bà Margaret Ellison không hỏi quá nhiều. Bà chỉ hỏi một câu, cô muốn học việc hay muốn được thương hại? Câu hỏi khiến Ottilie bất ngờ. Nàng đã quen với những người hỏi nàng là ai, nàng đến từ gia đình nào. Cha nàng để lại bao nhiêu tài sản, nhưng người phụ nữ này chỉ quan tâm nàng có sẵn sàng làm việc hay không. Tôi muốn học việc, Ottilie trả lời. Vậy thì bắt đầu từ việc nhỏ. Và thế là, trong những buổi sáng lạnh lẽo tiếp theo, con gái của Earl Ashcombe đứng trong một cửa hàng nhỏ giữa khu chợ làng, học cách tính, giá vải, kiểm tra sổ hàng và nói chuyện với những khách hàng không quan tâm nàng từng sống trong dinh thự nào. Lần đầu tiên trong đời, Ottilie kiếm được tiền bằng chính đôi tay mình. Số tiền không nhiều, chỉ vài bảng Anh sau nhiều tuần. Nhưng nó mang một ý nghĩa mà những món quà đắt giá trong Ashcombe chưa từng có. Nó thuộc về nàng, không ai ban cho. Không ai có thể dùng nó để nhắc nàng rằng nàng đang mang ơn. Một buổi chiều, khi nàng đang kiểm tra sổ sách trong cửa hàng, một cô gái trẻ làm thuê bước vào. Đó là Clara, con gái của một gia đình từng làm việc cho Ashcombe. Cô gái nhìn thấy Ottilie và lập tức cúi đầu. Miss Ashcombe. Ottilie ngẩng lên. Clara phải không? Cô gái ngạc nhiên. Cô còn nhớ tôi sao? Tất nhiên. Cô từng làm việc trong khu vườn phía đông. Clara mỉm cười buồn. Không nhiều người ở Ashcombe còn nhớ những người như chúng tôi. Câu nói ấy khiến Ottilie chú ý. Những người như chúng tôi. Clara nhìn ra ngoài cửa, rồi cô nói nhỏ. Tôi biết một chuyện về phòng làm việc cũ của cha cô. Ottilie đặt cây bút xuống. Chuyện gì? Có một đêm, sau khi cha cô mất, tôi thấy Lady Corisande và Mr. Hargrove ở đó. Clara siết hai tay. Họ cãi nhau. Về giấy tờ. Cô có nghe được gì không? Chỉ một câu. Clara nhìn thẳng vào nàng. Lady Corisande nói rằng bà ấy không thể để bản gốc tồn tại. Không khí trong cửa hàng dường như lạnh đi. Bản gốc, Ottilie lặp lại. Clara gật đầu. Tôi không biết đó là giấy gì, nhưng tôi nhớ vì ngay sau đêm đó, người quản gia cũ bị cho nghỉ việc. Ottilie im lặng. Manh mối. Một lần nữa, những mảnh rời rạc bắt đầu ghép lại. Tờ giấy trong hộp khóa, sổ sách bị thay đổi, những lá thư biến mất, và bây giờ là một bản gốc mà Corisande muốn xóa bỏ. Nhưng nàng cũng hiểu một điều khác. Bằng chứng không đủ nếu không có người dám nói. Clara vẫn là một cô gái trẻ từng phụ thuộc vào gia đình Ashcombe. Nếu nàng kéo cô vào cuộc chiến này quá sớm, Clara có thể mất việc, có thể mất cả cuộc sống bình thường. Ottilie nhìn cô gái trước mặt. Cô không cần phải nói thêm nếu điều đó khiến cô gặp nguy hiểm. Clara ngẩng lên. Nhưng nếu tôi im lặng, họ sẽ tiếp tục làm điều đó với người khác. Câu trả lời đơn giản ấy khiến Ottilie nhớ đến lời cha mình. Sự ngay thẳng không phải lúc nào cũng tạo ra chiến thắng ngay lập tức, nhưng nó là thứ duy nhất giúp một người không đánh mất chính mình. Buổi tối hôm đó, Ottilie trở về phòng nhỏ của mình tại Ashcombe với một quyết định mới. Nàng sẽ không chỉ tìm cách chứng minh Corisande sai. Nàng sẽ khiến sự thật được nói ra trước chính những người từng cười khi nàng bị làm nhục. Nhưng nàng chưa biết rằng Lady Corisande cũng đang chuẩn bị một bước đi cuối cùng. Một bước đi sẽ đưa câu chuyện về sự tỉnh táo của Ottilie đến trước cả giới thượng lưu London. Và nếu kế hoạch đó thành công, dù nàng có trong tay bao nhiêu giấy tờ, sẽ chẳng còn ai tin lời nàng nữa. The next morning, Ashcombe received a letter sealed with the crest of a respected physician from London. Lady Corisande had arranged everything carefully. She did not accuse Ottilie of madness. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she invited concern. Concern was far more dangerous because people accepted it as kindness. By midday, several members of the county families who had attended the winter gathering had heard the same story. Poor Miss Ashcombe had become withdrawn. Poor Miss Ashcombe had developed strange suspicions about her father's affairs. Poor Miss Ashcombe had begun searching through documents and accusing trusted people without proof. Every sentence sounded gentle. Every sentence carried a blade. Ottilie learned about it when she returned from the village and found a sealed invitation waiting in her room. It was not an invitation to a social gathering. It was a request for a private examination from the physician Lady Corisande had invited. Ottilie read the letter twice. Then she placed it on the table. The trap was no longer hidden. That almost made it easier. Mrs. Whitcombe stood near the fireplace, her expression troubled. If you refuse, they will say you are avoiding help. If I accept, Ottilie replied, they may use my words against me. The housekeeper lowered her eyes. Yes, the answer was simple, and that was precisely why it was dangerous. Ottilie walked toward the window. Outside, rain covered the gardens that her father had once walked through with her. The paths were empty, the trees were bare. Everything looked as though winter had claimed the entire estate. But she had learned something in the village. Winter did not mean death. It meant waiting. It meant preparing beneath the surface. I will meet him, Ottilie said. Mrs. Whitcombe looked surprised. You will? Yes. Because if Lady Corisande wants the world to believe I cannot be trusted, then I must allow the world to see exactly who I am. It was the first time Ottilie had chosen to step toward danger rather than away from it. Not because she was fearless, because she finally understood that fear was also something other people could use as a chain. The meeting took place in the library, the same room where her father had once taught her about accounts and responsibility. The irony was not lost on Ottilie. Lady Corisande sat beside the fireplace, dressed in dark green velvet. Beside her sat Dr. Lionel Fairfax, an older physician with a serious expression and careful manners. He did not look cruel. That made the situation more complicated. A cruel man was easy to resist. A respectable man could be convinced to cause harm while believing he was doing good. Miss Ashcombe, Dr. Fairfax began, I understand there have been difficulties since your father's passing. Ottilie sat opposite him. There have. And you have found yourself troubled by certain concerns regarding the management of the estate. I have found inconsistencies. Lady Corisande looked down sadly. There. That word, inconsistencies, a word that could mean careful observation or unreasonable suspicion depending on who heard it. Dr. Fairfax folded his hands. "Can you explain these concerns?" Ottilie looked directly at him. Yes. She spoke calmly. She explained the missing letters, the altered accounts, the documents she had not been allowed to see. She did not exaggerate. She did not accuse without evidence. She simply described what had happened. When she finished, the room remained quiet. Dr. Fairfax glanced toward Lady Corisande. For a brief moment, Ottilie saw uncertainty. Then Corisande spoke. "You see, Doctor, this is exactly what I feared." She turned toward Ottilie with a sorrowful expression. "You have taken ordinary family matters and turned them into something much larger." Ottilie felt anger rise, but she controlled it. Because she remembered something her father once told her. The person who loses control first often loses the room. Dr. Fairfax looked thoughtful. "Miss Ashcombe, may I ask something?" "Of course. Do you believe everyone in this house is against you?" The question was carefully chosen. A single wrong answer could become a weapon. Ottilie looked at the man, then at Lady Corisande, then at the door. The same door where servants had once overheard secrets, the same house where people had learned to remain silent. "No," she answered. "I do not believe everyone is against me. I believe some people have benefited from my silence." The physician studied her face. "And who do you believe those people are?" Ottilie did not answer immediately, because she knew a direct accusation would be remembered more than the facts. Instead, she reached into her pocket and removed a small notebook. "This is my father's account copy." She placed it on the table. "These figures do not match the official records." Dr. Fairfax looked at the pages. Lady Corisande's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. Ottilie saw it, the fear. For the first time, she saw genuine fear. Not anger, not annoyance, fear, because the notebook was not supposed to exist. "Where did you obtain this?" Corisande asked. Ottilie closed the cover. "That is not the first question you should ask. The first question should be why the records were changed." The room fell silent, a real silence, not the polite silence of a drawing room, the kind of silence that appeared when someone had spoken a truth nobody wanted to answer. Dr. Fairfax did not declare Ottilie unstable. He did not declare her innocent either, but he left the library with a different expression than the one he entered with. Doubt had replaced certainty, and doubt was the first crack in Corisande's carefully built wall. That evening, Lady Corisande did something she had avoided for months. She lost her composure. Ottilie heard the argument while passing the corridor near the study. She did not intend to listen, but the door was slightly open. And inside, Mr. Percival Hargrove's voice carried through the gap. "You told me she had no evidence." Corisande replied sharply. "She should not have had it. You underestimated her." A pause followed. Then Hargrove spoke again. "If the original document still exists, we cannot allow her to reach London." Ottilie stopped. The words settled in her mind. Not if, when. The original document still existed. Corisande lowered her voice. "Then we must make certain she never presents it." Ottilie stepped away before they could discover her. Her heart beat quickly, but beneath the fear was something stronger. Confirmation. For months, she had been searching for proof that she was not imagining what happened. Now she had it, not on paper, not yet, but in their own fear. She returned to her room and opened the account notebook again. The missing piece was still somewhere inside Ashcombe, the original document, the one her father had protected, the one Corisande wanted, destroyed, and Ottilie finally understood the real battle. She was not fighting to prove that she belonged in Ashcombe. She was fighting to reveal why someone had been so desperate to remove her from it. But as she prepared her next move, she did not know that Lady Corisande had already sent a message to London. A message requesting the presence of someone powerful enough to silence Ottilie before the truth ever reached the public. The message was sent that same night. Lady Corisande did not write many words. She did not need to. People of her position understood how to ask for assistance without appearing desperate. A carefully chosen sentence, a mention of family reputation, a reminder of old friendships, and a warning that a young woman's unfortunate imagination threatened the stability of an old name. By morning, the reply had already been promised. Someone from London would come, someone whose voice carried more weight than hers, someone who could make society doubt Ottilie before Ottilie ever had the chance to speak. But Lady Corisande had overlooked one thing. Ottilie was no longer the young woman who waited in a quiet room, hoping someone would notice her pain. She had spent days in the village. She had spoken with people who measured their lives by work rather than titles. She had learned that respect was not always found in grand houses. Sometimes it existed in a small shop where a widow trusted her with accounts. Sometimes it existed in an old clerk who had kept papers hidden because he believed the truth mattered. Sometimes it existed in a young servant girl who risked her position simply because silence felt worse, and those lessons had changed her. The following afternoon, Ottilie returned to the village market. She went first to Mr. Bell's shop. The older man looked up as she entered. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. Ottilie nodded. "I heard them speak." Mr. Bell's expression became serious. "Who?" "Lady Corisande and Mr. Hargrove." The old clerk closed the book in front of him. "What did they say?" Ottilie repeated the words she had overheard. The original document still exists. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Bell walked toward the back room and returned with another wrapped bundle. "There was something else your father left instructions about." Ottilie looked at the package. "Why did you not show me this before?" "Because I was not certain you were ready." The answer surprised her. "Ready?" Mr. Bell placed the bundle on the table. "Miss Ashcombe, finding the truth is not the same as surviving after it is found." He slowly removed the cloth. Inside was a collection of letters, not many, perhaps 6 or 7. But each one carried the seal of Ashcombe. "Your father wrote these during his final months." Ottilie reached for the first letter. Her hands trembled slightly. Not because she was afraid of what she would discover, because she feared discovering that the father she trusted had known everything and still could not protect her. She opened the letter carefully. The words were familiar. His handwriting, his careful, steady manner. He wrote about concerns regarding the estate. He wrote about changes in accounts. He wrote about people around him who had become too interested in controlling Ashcombe. But he also wrote something else, something that made Ottilie stop reading. "If my daughter ever finds these letters, it means circumstances have prevented me from speaking to her myself. She must not believe that silence means abandonment. Sometimes silence is the final protection a person can offer." Ottilie closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not in the small village shop. She was a child sitting beside her father in the library. The fire was burning. The rain was outside. And she was asking him why numbers mattered so much. He had smiled and told her that numbers remembered what people tried to forget. A tear escaped before she could stop it, but she wiped it away quickly. Mr. Bell did not pretend not to notice. "Your father believed you would be stronger than those who underestimated you." Ottilie looked at the letters. "I wish he had trusted me enough to tell me." The old man nodded. "Perhaps he should have." Then he paused. "But perhaps he also knew that if you had carried this burden while he was alive, you would have spent your youth fighting a battle that was never yours." To begin, the words remained with her, because they changed the way she saw the past. Her father had not left her helpless. He had left her time. Time to become someone who could stand. When Ottilie returned to Ashcombe, she discovered that another change had taken place. Her room had been searched. Nothing valuable was missing. That was what made it worse. The pearl brooch from her mother remained. The small amount of money she kept hidden remained. Only one thing was gone: the account notebook. Ottilie stood beside the small wooden box, staring at the empty space where it had been kept. For a moment, anger replaced all other feelings. Not the anger of someone losing an object, the anger of someone realizing another person believed they had the right to enter her life and remove whatever they wanted. Mrs. Whitcombe entered quietly. She immediately understood. "They searched your room." Ottilie nodded. The housekeeper's face turned pale. "Who?" "I do not know, but I know what they wanted." "The notebook." Mrs. Whitcombe looked toward the hallway. "Then we must assume they know what it contains." Ottilie picked up the empty box. "No, She placed it back carefully. They know it exists. That is different. Because now I know something they do not. What? Ottilie looked at the fireplace. They are afraid. For years, Lady Corisande had made everyone else feel afraid. Afraid to question, afraid to speak, afraid to lose their place. But fear had changed sides, and Ottilie knew she needed to use that carefully. She could not rush to accuse. She could not reveal every piece she had. She needed the moment when all the evidence would be impossible to dismiss. The moment when the same people who laughed at her would have no choice but to listen. 3 days later, a carriage arrived at Ashcombe. Not a family carriage, not a local vehicle. A polished London carriage with a crest belonging to a man whose name carried influence among the upper classes. Ottilie watched from the upstairs window as a gentleman stepped down. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a sharp expression and the careful confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lady Corisande greeted him personally. They spoke briefly near the entrance. Then the man looked toward the house, toward the windows, toward Ottilie's room. She understood immediately. He was not there to discover the truth. He was there to decide which version of the truth society would accept. That evening, Mrs. Whitcombe brought the information quietly. His name is Lord Edmund Fairchild. He has known Lady Corisande's family for years. Ottilie nodded. A powerful ally. Yes. The housekeeper hesitated, but there is something else. What? Mrs. Whitcombe lowered her voice. Your father once helped his family during a difficult matter. Ottilie turned. Then perhaps he will remember that kindness. Or perhaps, Mrs. Whitcombe replied carefully, he will remember the favor he owes. The distinction mattered. Ottilie looked toward the warm glow of the drawing room below. For the first time, she understood the true size of the battle. She was not only fighting Lady Corisande, she was fighting the comfort of people who preferred a convenient lie over an uncomfortable truth. But she also knew something now. Every powerful person had something they protected, a reputation, a promise, a secret, and somewhere inside Ashcombe, hidden behind locked doors and carefully rewritten papers, was the one thing that could bring them all down, the original document, the one Lady Corisande believed she had destroyed, the one Ottilie had not yet found. The following morning, Ottilie made a decision that even Mrs. Whitcombe considered dangerous. She would return to the one place where Lady Corisande believed she had complete control, the old study. The room remained locked most of the time now. Lord Fairchild's arrival had made the household busier, with servants moving carefully and guests whispering behind closed doors. That distraction gave Ottilie the opportunity she needed. She waited until the late afternoon, when the house was occupied with preparations for dinner. Then she walked quietly along the corridor. The key was not in Lady Corisande's possession. That was the first thing that surprised her. The second was where she found it, inside the small drawer of her father's old writing desk in the corner of the library. A place no one had thought to search because everyone believed the study held the only secrets of Ashcombe. Ottilie held the key in her palm. For a moment, she hesitated, not because she feared what was behind the door, because she understood that once she opened it, she could no longer pretend she was only trying to defend herself. She was uncovering a truth that could destroy the people who had spent years building their lives around a falsehood. The lock turned with a quiet click. Inside the study, everything appeared untouched. The same shelves, the same heavy curtains, the same chair where her father had sat. But Ottilie noticed something immediately. One section of the shelves was slightly uneven, a small detail, almost invisible. The kind of thing most people would never see, but her father had taught her to look for things that did not belong. She moved closer. Behind a row of old estate records was a narrow wooden compartment built into the wall. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a fortune, not jewels, not anything that could have been stolen for personal gain. There was only a single sealed envelope, and on the front, written in her father's hand, were 4 words: for Ottilie, when the truth comes. She held the envelope close. But before she could break the seal, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Someone was approaching. Ottilie quickly hid the envelope inside her dress and turned toward the door. The handle moved, and she realized she was no longer searching for the truth alone. Someone else had been searching for it too. Lady Corisande remained standing in the center of the ballroom. For several moments, she did not move. The woman who had once controlled every conversation at Ashcombe now stood beneath the same chandeliers where she had watched Ottilie be humiliated months earlier. The same room that had witnessed laughter and whispers now held only silence, not the silence of politeness. The silence of people waiting to discover which version of the truth would survive. Lord Fairchild kept the documents in his hand. "The matter before us is not a private disagreement between family members," he said. "It concerns the management of an estate, the alteration of records, and the misuse of trust." His voice remained calm. That calmness carried more power than anger would have. In their world, anger could be dismissed as emotion. Calm certainty was much harder to ignore. Lady Corisande lifted her chin. "My lord, I must object. This entire situation has been created because a grieving young woman has misunderstood matters that are beyond her experience." A few guests looked toward Ottilie. Months earlier, those same words might have wounded her. They would have made her question herself. Not anymore. Because she understood the difference between someone questioning her and someone trying to erase her, Ottilie stepped forward. "I did not misunderstand what I saw." Her voice was quiet, but the room heard every word. "I saw letters that never reached me. I saw accounts that did not match. I saw decisions made about my father's estate without my knowledge." She looked around the ballroom. "And I remained silent because I believed silence would protect my family's name." A pause followed. Then she continued. "But I learned that silence does not always protect a family. Sometimes it protects the people who are harming it." The words settled over the room. No one laughed. No one looked away. Because everyone there understood the uncomfortable truth. They had not all participated in the deception. But many had benefited from not asking questions. Lord Fairchild opened the first document. This record shows payments made through Mr. Percival Hargrove's office after the Earl Ashcombe's death. He turned the paper slightly so those nearest could see. "The dates and figures are inconsistent with the official accounts." A murmur moved through the guests. Mr. Hargrove stood near the back of the room. For the first time that evening, his confidence disappeared. Lady Corisande looked toward him, only briefly, but the look revealed more than any confession. It was not anger, it was fear. Mr. Hargrove noticed it too, and perhaps that was the moment he realized he had been protecting someone who would not protect him in return. Lord Fairchild faced him. "Would you like to explain your involvement?" The man swallowed. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked around the room. At the noble families, at the people whose approval had once mattered more than anything, at the people who now watched him carefully. "I was instructed to make certain changes." "By whom?" The silence that followed answered before he did. Lady Corisande stepped forward. "This is absurd." But her voice no longer carried the same certainty. Mr. Hargrove lowered his eyes. "By Lady Corisande." The room changed. It was not dramatic. No one shouted. No one gasped loudly. But something invisible broke. A belief. The belief that Lady Corisande always knew best. The belief that her kindness was genuine. The belief that Ottilie had been the problem. Ottilie watched her stepmother carefully. She expected anger, perhaps even denial. Instead, she saw something else. A woman realizing that the story she had created had finally escaped her control. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came slowly, and that made them impossible to ignore. In the weeks following the London gathering, Lady Corisande discovered that society could be colder than any winter at Ashcombe. No one openly insulted her. That would have been considered improper. Instead, the invitations stopped. Letters became shorter. Conversations ended when she entered a room. People who had once praised her judgment suddenly became too busy to visit. The world she had spent years trying to impress began turning away. It was not a punishment arranged by Ottilie. She never asked for it. She never encouraged it. It was simply the natural result of a reputation losing its foundation. Mr. Hargrove was forced to answer questions about the estate accounts and his role in changing them. The protection he had relied upon disappeared once the truth became impossible to hide. Ashcombe itself changed. The servants noticed first. The house no longer carried the same tension. The corridors were no longer filled with quiet fear. People spoke normally again. The kitchen became a place of conversation rather than whispered warnings. The servants' rooms became a place where people could discuss their lives without wondering who might repeat their words. Mrs. Whitcombe, who had served Ashcombe for many years, returned to her duties with a confidence that had been missing since the Earl's death. One morning, she found Ottilie reviewing estate accounts in the library, the same library where her father had once taught her, the same room where Corisande had once tried to convince her she had no place. "You have changed," Mrs. Whitcombe said. Ottilie looked up. "Have I?" The older woman smiled. "Yes. Before, you entered this room as though you needed permission. Now you enter it as though you belong." Ottilie looked around. For so long she had believed belonging was something other people granted. A family, a husband, a society. But she understood now. Belonging was not created by acceptance from others. It was created by knowing who she was, even when others refused to see her. Lady Corisande requested one final conversation, not in the drawing room, not in the library, not anywhere inside the house where appearances mattered. She asked Ottilie to meet her in the garden, the place where truth had always been easier to speak. The winter had passed, the cold remained, but it no longer felt like a punishment. Small signs of spring had begun appearing beneath the trees. The garden that had once held only bare branches now carried the promise of renewal. Lady Corisande arrived without the confidence she once carried. She looked older, not because time had changed her, because consequences had. Ottilie stood near the old stone bench, the same bench where she had found her father's hidden letter, the same place where she had discovered that the truth had been waiting for her all along. Lady Corisande stopped a few steps away. "You have won." Ottilie looked toward the garden. "No." The answer surprised her. Lady Corisande frowned. "No, I have not won. I have learned." The older woman looked away. "You sound like your father. Perhaps that is why you always disliked me." The words were not cruel. They were simply honest. Lady Corisande was silent. Then she spoke. "I did not come to make excuses." Ottilie waited. For perhaps the first time, Lady Corisande had nothing prepared. No carefully chosen explanation, no performance. Only the truth. "I was afraid." The confession was quiet. Ottilie said nothing. "I came to Ashcombe with a title but little security. Everyone believed my position made me powerful. They did not understand how easily a woman could lose everything." She looked toward the house. "I believed control was the only protection." Ottilie listened. "And when you saw me as a threat, you decided I was something to remove." Lady Corisande closed her eyes. "Yes, the admission carried more weight than any excuse could have. I convinced myself that I was protecting my future, but I was destroying someone else's." For a moment, the two women stood in silence. Not the silence of enemies, not friendship. Something more complicated. The understanding that two people could recognize the truth of what happened without pretending the damage had never existed. "I am sorry," Lady Corisande said. Ottilie looked at her. The apology was not enough to erase years. It could not return the invitations she lost. It could not remove the humiliation. It could not restore the trust that had been broken. But it was still an apology, and that mattered. "I believe you are sorry," Ottilie said. Lady Corisande looked at her. But I cannot become the person I was before." The older woman nodded slowly. She understood. Some things could be forgiven. Some things could only be accepted. Ottilie did not offer a false reconciliation. She did not promise that everything would return to what it had been, because it could not. Too much had happened. Instead, she offered something more honest, a chance for each of them to continue separately, and perhaps, one day, to remember the past without being controlled by it. Lady Corisande left the garden quietly. Ottilie watched her go. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel revenge. She felt peace, because the battle had never truly been about defeating another person. It had been about refusing to disappear. Months later, the name Ashcombe was spoken differently. People no longer remembered only the wealth of the estate. They remembered the scandal. But more importantly, they remembered the woman who stood when others expected her to fall. Ottilie continued managing parts of the estate. She continued working with the village shop. She continued learning the practical details of business and accounts. The work remained difficult, but it belonged to her. That was what made it meaningful. She no longer measured her worth by the size of her home, the approval of society, or the opinions of people who had never taken the time to know her. She measured it by the choices she made, by the kindness she gave, by the courage she carried. One spring morning, Ottilie returned to the garden. The flowers had begun to bloom. The fountain was running again. The paths were no longer covered with frost. Mrs. Whitcombe brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "Your father would have been proud." Ottilie smiled. She looked toward Ashcombe. The house no longer seemed like a place that had taken everything from her. It was simply a place, stone and wood, rooms and halls. A home became meaningful because of the people who lived within it, not because of its size, not because of its name, not because of what society believed it represented. Ottilie thought about the girl who had once stood outside those doors with wine staining her gown. That girl had believed she had lost everything, but she had not. She had lost an illusion, the illusion that her value came from being accepted by others. And in losing that, she had found something far greater, her own voice. The truth was never powerful because it was the loudest thing in the room. It was powerful because it remained when every lie had finally disappeared. If this story of courage, justice, and dignity touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and support the channel for more forgotten voices finding the truth they deserve. The years that followed did not erase the memory of what happened at Ashcombe. They changed its meaning. Visitors who came to the estate no longer spoke only of portraits, inherited lands, or the generations of noble families who had walked through its halls. They spoke of the woman who had once been treated as though she had no voice, and had later become the person whose judgment guided the future of the house. Ottilie never forgot the cost of that transformation. There were still moments when an old remark returned to her, a cruel sentence, a forgotten invitation, the sound of laughter from that winter evening. But those memories no longer controlled her. They had become reminders of how far she had traveled. One afternoon, while reviewing estate records in the library, Ottilie discovered a small account book that had belonged to her father. It was not one of the documents that had been hidden or altered. It was simply a personal notebook. Inside were observations about tenants, workers, repairs, and the daily needs of the people connected to Ashcombe. She smiled when she read the final pages. Her father had not written about increasing the family's influence. He had written about responsibility. For the first time, Ottilie understood that the greatest inheritance he had given her was never a house or a name. It was the belief that power existed to protect, not to control. She later used that lesson to improve the lives of those who depended on Ashcombe. She ensured that workers' concerns were heard, that accounts remained transparent, and that decisions were made with care rather than pride. The changes were not dramatic. They did not happen overnight. But slowly, the estate became known for something different, not for the wealth behind its walls, for the fairness within them. Many years later, when people told the story of Ashcombe, they often began with the evening when a quiet young woman had wine thrown over her gown. But they never ended there. They ended with the image of Ottilie walking through the same halls with confidence, no longer asking whether she belonged. Because she had learned something that no title, inheritance, or social approval could ever teach. A person's worth was not created by those who accepted them, and it could not be destroyed by those who rejected them. It was carried within them from the beginning. Years after the events that changed Ashcombe forever, Ottilie discovered that the greatest challenge was not proving herself to those who doubted her. It was learning to live without, constantly preparing for the next attack. For so long she had measured every word, every movement, every decision. She had entered rooms expecting judgment before kindness. She had listened for hidden meanings behind ordinary conversations. She had learned survival before she learned peace. But peace, she discovered, required a different kind of courage. One quiet spring evening, Ottilie walked through the library alone. The fire burned softly. The shelves remained filled with the same books her father had once studied. The room no longer felt like a place where secrets were hidden. It felt like a place where memories were allowed to remain, On the desk sat the old account notebook she had found among her father's belongings. She opened it again, not because she needed proof, not because she needed to defend herself, but because she finally understood that some things were worth remembering simply because they had shaped who she became. Inside the final pages, she found a note she had never noticed before. It was not about money, not about inheritance, not about Ashcombe. It was a simple sentence written in her father's hand. The strongest foundations are built by those who care for what others overlook. Ottilie read it several times. Then she closed the book. Outside the window, the gardens were beginning to bloom again. The same gardens where she had once stood feeling abandoned. The same gardens where she had found the truth. The same gardens where she had finally understood that losing the approval of others was not the same as losing herself. Not long afterward, a young woman from the village came to Ashcombe seeking advice. Her name was Clara. The same Clara who had once risked her position by speaking about what she had witnessed years earlier. Time had changed her as well. She was no longer the frightened servant girl who had lowered her voice in fear of being overheard. She had learned bookkeeping and now helped several small businesses in the village manage their records. "I wanted to thank you," Clara said. Ottilie smiled. "For what?" "For proving that people like us can be heard." Ottilie looked at her carefully. "People like us?" Clara smiled. "People who are told they should stay quiet." The words stayed with Ottilie, because she remembered being called quiet as though it were an insult, as though silence meant emptiness. But she knew better now. Some quiet people observed. Some quiet people remembered. Some quiet people waited until the moment when their voices could no longer be ignored. "You did not need me to prove that," Ottilie said. Clara shook her head. "Perhaps not. But sometimes people need to see someone else stand before they believe they can stand too." Ottilie looked toward the fields beyond Ashcombe. For years, she had believed her victory was restoring what had been taken from her. Her position, her reputation, her place in the family. Now she understood that the true victory was different. It was making certain that others did not have to lose themselves before discovering their own worth. The evening light moved across the garden paths. Ashcombe remained the same house. The stones were the same. The halls were the same. The rooms were the same. But the meaning of the place had changed forever, because a house was not defined by the names carved above its entrance. It was defined by the choices made inside its walls. And when the old stories of Ashcombe were told, people no longer remembered the wealth that once filled its rooms. They remembered the woman who had stood alone, found the truth, and proved that dignity could survive even when everything else was taken away.